Hello, everyone. My name is Chandler Kim, and I am SVP of Marketing at Trinity Cyber. I'll be your host and moderator for today's webinar, Nation-State Level Cyber Attacks. Are you ready? Thank you very much for joining. Cyber threats and nation-state level cyber attacks in particular are definitely topical, as we all know. Some believe that government agencies and critical infrastructure providers are the primary groups who need to be concerned. However, the truth is that any organization that makes money or contributes to society or targets, regardless of their size or market segment. Today, we'll explore more on this topic with two of our industry's most notable experts. It's my pleasure to introduce today's special guest speakers. Sander Vinberg is a threat researcher for F5 Labs. As the lead on F5 Labs' Application Protection Report, he specializes in the long-term evolution of the threat landscape. Steve Ryan is founder and chief executive officer of Trinity Cyber and is a recognized leader in cybersecurity. Steve was previously with the National Security Agency as their deputy director of their Threat Operations Center. Our webinar format today is straightforward. After an initial opening statement from each of our speakers, we'll have an open Q&A style discussion with additional questions from our audience towards the end of our session. If anyone in the audience would like to submit a question for our speakers, please use the chat function. So with that, let's jump into it. Sander, I'm going to start with you and let you kick us off.
Thanks, Chandler. So before I ever got started in security, my background was actually in history, and I was a historian for a while. And because of that, I often sort of fall back on a historical lens when I'm trying to sort of make sense of a phenomenon like the one that we're looking at today. And so I think that there are kind of two historical perspectives that are really useful in understanding the relationship between state-sponsored actors and the kind of risk that private sector organizations are looking at. And the first is that I kind of want to cast everyone's mind back to World War II and sort of how air war evolved during World War II. And as that war went on, there was a sort of a growing bifurcation between what you would call sort of strategic bombing and tactical bombing. And tactical bombing is oriented around the battlefield, that is about supporting tactical objectives in a war, like taking territory, destroying equipment, that sort of thing. Strategic war is more about economic war, right? It's about destroying factories, destroying raw materials, that sort of thing, so that an entire nation state is not able to participate in a war. And the reason why I think that this is a good metaphor is that a lot of what we're seeing today in terms of how nation states are sort of projecting force within the information security space is really about economic warfare and sort of generating value through means that are not really what we would think of as a cyber war, right? And so obviously the last 6 months or so of events have changed the conversation when we're talking about nation state actors. And there's the concept of cyber war is kind of front and center for everybody right now. And so the real point that I'm making is that cyber war might not necessarily show up on our doorsteps in the form that we might be sort of habituated to take. So that's the first historical lens, is I want people to sort of think about nation state behaviors, both on a tactical sort of battlefield level and on an economic strategic level. The other historical lens I want to throw out is to really sort of emphasize how much the threat landscape in terms of attacker tools and attacker behaviors, how much that's changed in the last couple of years. I think that we've all seen a lot of discussion about how ransomware has sort of exploded in popularity. I could sort of throw out numbers based on my own research and based on my own reports on that, but I think everybody understands that there's been a big change here. But really understanding the relationship between attacker goals, like what are they trying to do when they choose a specific type of attack. I think understanding that is key to understanding who's really at risk. And so the way that I would characterize the changes in the last couple of years with the growth of ransomware and the sort of increasing focus and constriction of web exploit type attacks, I think the best way to understand is that attackers have finally figured out what ransomware is really good for, which is selling data back to the people you just stole it from. So they just found kind of the perfect buyer for stolen data, right? And when you look at it like that, it doesn't actually help you defend it in real time, but it does really make it clear who is a potential target. And the way that I always put this is that everyone is a target for ransomware unless they're a better target for a more specific kind of attack. So really the point here is that nobody can afford to say that this risk doesn't apply to me. And so I think that those two kind of historical lenses are a good way for us to sort of set up, what are we going to do about this threat, and how can we really get in front of this and try to kind of shut this vector down before it causes any more damage. Steve, what do you think?
Sander, that was really cool. Thanks for that. Thanks for that introduction. So I was part of the NSA Threat Operations Center leadership from the time of its creation in 2005 until I retired in 2016. The NTOC, as we called it, was the nerve center at NSA, focused on nation-state cyber threat and what we could do about that cyber threat to protect U.S. national security systems. You know, and back then, there were a couple of things that differentiated nation-state cyber adversaries from everyone else. One was the sophistication of their tradecraft, typically stealthy, and typically reserving the most sophisticated tools for when they needed them. And the sad thing was, at a national level, is that when we watched nation states, they rarely needed those sophisticated tools because they could usually walk right in with something pretty pedestrian. The second thing, in addition to their tradecraft, was their motivation. And this ties into what you were just talking about, Sander, right? Usually we saw, that some wanted state secrets, right? And when you think of that, and those of us who lived through those times, and even today, maybe you think about the Russians and maybe the Chinese a little bit. Some wanted IP, intellectual property, where they could enhance their state. A lot of folks think about the Chinese actors that way. Or that they wanted to make some sort of statement with their actions. Think Iranian DDoSes or North Korea going after Sony. And so a lot of that stuff kind of stayed pretty consistent. And I think what we're seeing today is a little bit of a shift, right? While on one hand, we certainly are watching stuff unfold even today. After the SolarWinds hack, big strategic move there, thousands of victims, Russians having access for many months before discovery. And I think a lot of folks are still looking at that in the rearview mirror, and it is not a rearview mirror thing. That should still be a front and center event that we should all be paying attention to. But one of the things that I think that really stuck out there was, we saw this Russian activity, and then shortly after we saw some Chinese activity that was associated with the Russian activity, right? And so maybe there's a little cooperation going on there, and that, that's something that we should kind of keep front in mind. The economic piece that's, I think, happening today is as more and more economic sanctions get levied on Russia, you've got these really highly sophisticated, very skilled set of cyber bad guys that aren't getting paid. And so ransomware is a really good way to get paid, isn't it? And so I think we're beginning to see, the bleeding, and the merging of these two things, especially on the economic side. So I think that's something that we're really going to have to pay attention to. One of the things that I observed in my time in the NSA Threat Operations Center is something that really hasn't changed much today, and that's that the thing that sets one set of bad guys apart from the other is their tradecraft, is the techniques or the methods that they use. They spend a lot of time developing these things or buying them. In many cases. And so, where folks like Sander will spend their times in the lab environments really studying these bad guys and understanding their techniques, right down to the DNA, what's the rest of the community do? They're like, hey, everybody, I'm seeing the Russians coming from this IP address. Let's block them. And it's crazy. I mean, to me, it's nuts, right? We have the ability to understand the techniques, and we have the ability to defeat techniques, but we don't do that, right? We kind of take the easy way, which is why, I think we're continually on our heels. One of the things I'm looking forward to talking about a little bit today, not to turn this into an advertisement, but F5's SSLO product is just premier capability to be able to peer inside of internet sessions, and coupled with an engine like ours that can identify techniques and defeat them in flight, is something that I can't wait to talk about even more. Chandler, you're muted.
Oh, thank you very much, Steve. So
somebody had to say it once in this call, right?
That's great. So Sandra, let me give the first question to you. You've done a lot of research in this area about understanding the threat landscape. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between state actors and cybercrime?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the cybercrime world sort of functions as both. How can I put this? It sort of provides a lot of operational cover for state-sponsored actors, in the sense that some proportion of actual cybercriminal activity is related to state-sponsored actors, and it's actually really difficult to know in any given moment what that proportion looks like, because these things change behind the scenes, and there are not that many organizations outside of government intelligence organizations that really have tabs on that sort of thing. So it operates as cover because, if you are a cyber criminal organization and somebody is able to actually pin you down and say, we are quite confident, 95% confident that this is Fin6 or Lazarus Group or whatever it is, there's not actually that much that can be done. But if anybody can ever pin it and say, we're actually 95% certain that this is a government entity, we start getting into war conversations, right? And so avoiding attribution or avoiding definitive attribution is really important for these state-sponsored actors. So the cybercrime community kind of gives them a lot of deep cover to operate. And this kind of goes to the other aspect of it, which is that cybercrime also provides a sort of testing ground or proving ground for TTPs before they're necessarily weaponized in a state-sponsored environment. And actually, one of the threat intel folks that works within F5, sort of watching threats to the F5 environment, told me that she's been observing this more and more, is state-sponsored actors are developing TTPs, farming them out to the cybercrime community through connections that they have, and then sort of using that to refine and improve their tools before then they save them for maybe using in a zero-day attack against a more sensitive target. And so it's kind of both cover and a proving ground. And the tricky bit, the third thing that I think we need to really be concerned about, or something that's keeping me up at night rather, is we're starting to see more sort of cross-group linkages and a little bit more of what I would sort of think of as division of labor within the attacker community. Which in turn gives attackers the opportunity to specialize, right? And so it's not like we're looking at one group that has a few malware specialists and a few intrusion specialists and a few persistent specialists. We're looking at an open marketplace where people are getting footprints into enterprise environments, and then they're selling that access to other actors. And the reason that keeps me up at night is that makes it more likely that a best of breed attack is going to show up, and that we're not going to see an attack that maybe was really sophisticated in one sense get hamstrung by limitations in the other sense, right? So all of these things are kind of working together. I think the main thing to understand is that a lot of state-sponsored activity that we would sort of, if you didn't know better, you would think nation states fight nation states, and I'm not one of those. So fortunately, I can just sort of stay out of it, right? But it doesn't work like that. And function state-sponsored actors know that they can make a huge amount of money off of targets in the private sector or targets that don't have these kind of nation-state level defenses. And so it is kind of, well, shooting fish in a barrel on some days.
So, Steve, kind of related to that, you mentioned in your open statement the importance of understanding attacker methods, especially those from nation-state attackers. They're more sophisticated. Sanders mentioned that they are a issue for all organizations, not just government entities, as we mentioned in the opening. Why is it so important to understand and those attack methods and procedures and tactics to mitigating or even preventing threats? What's the big deal there?
Well, you sort of answered the question with the last part of the questions, Chandler. A lot of folks will get an interest in this stuff and again, study these attackers, study their methods, write reports. But if you really do want to protect against them and prevent these things, then it's the study of those methods and really understanding what part of their technique makes them successful. Is it the math behind their obfuscation that's just so hard to get your head around? Is it the structure of their code? Is it where they hide where they hide their malware? Is it bolted onto the back of an image, or is it tucked away inside of a VBA somewhere, right? Understanding those techniques, I think, are like the very first stage to being able to do something about them, especially at the nation state level, right? One of the things I often get very concerned about is there are a lot of threat intelligence teams out there that have great insight into the bad guys that they're watching, and they don't want to share that insight. You know why? Because what they're afraid somebody's going to do is do the simple thing that a lot of people do already, and that's block the IP address or the domain that the bad guy just newly registered. That will signal to the bad guy that there's some intelligence team that's onto him, right? And then the intelligence team loses the bad guy. That's a classic intelligence gain loss conundrum, right? And so many intelligence teams are faced with this, and it's part of the reason that they don't share the good stuff. So what if I told you that if you really understood the technique, not the, where they happen to be coming from today, or what document their payload is in today, but you really understood the technique they employed, and you could quite literally reach into the network sessions and either modify that technique or neutralize that technique in flight. That kind of stuff doesn't telegraph anything, right? I'm a bad guy. I'm launching this thing that, has worked every other time I used it. It doesn't work today, right? It didn't work this last time I tried it. What are you going to do as a bad guy when that happens, right? Are you going to say, oh, Xander's team must be onto me? No, you're not. You're going to think, I must have done something wrong, right? Let me try it again. Like when you point your remote at your TV and it doesn't turn it on. Are you thinking that somebody, broke into your house and messed with your TV? No, you think maybe you have to put new batteries in the remote, right? So it's these kinds of things that if we can kind of get out of this whack-a-mole mindset and start thinking about the techniques and the tradecraft that bad guys use, and then start employing capabilities that can deny those techniques in flight, then I really do believe we can start getting ahead of this stuff and getting in front of it. And again, put your bad guy hat on. You might spend weeks or months developing, or years developing, this and refining this technique that you use. And it stops working, man, that's really going to set you back. You block an IP address, I can come from another one in a nanosecond. But you mess with my technique, it's game over for me for a while, and I'm going to be back to the drawing board. And I think that's that's a real key that that we've got to get at. Proven that we can do this kind of stuff in the past, but sometimes we just we forget. We go back to doing things like blocking IPs and domains.
So, Sandra, I don't know, did you want to add something to that, or?
Yeah, I agree. Actually, kind of across the board, and one of the things that my team and I talk about a lot is the sort of slippery concept in our field about the sophisticated attackers, right? And some, I mean, we throw around APTs, sophisticated attackers, well-resourced attackers, state-sponsored actors, all this sort of thing, and we have done so ever since the Mandiant report in 2013 with APT1, right? And I remember really distinctly consuming that report and looking at the little satellite screenshot of the building within Shanghai where this BLA organization was operating, right? We've all sort of done this journey in terms of trying to attribute attacks, and increasingly, the way that I think about it is at one end of the sophistication spectrum, we have attackers who have a set of TTPs. They have their tool set already defined because it's kind of the only thing that they can use. And they choose targets based on what TTPs they have, right? So this is the unsophisticated end of the spectrum, and they are shooting at anybody in range, so to speak. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the absolute most sophisticated folks who are not necessarily just state sponsored, but these are actually sort of military operations. These folks choose their targets, and then, as Steve was just alluding, they develop their tools to suit the target. At the other end, we have people that are choosing their targets based on their tools. Most attackers are somewhere in the middle. Most attackers have a toolkit of some level of diversity and some sort of level of operational flexibility, but they're still sort of just chasing vulnerabilities that they know are open. They're chasing software that they know is vulnerable. They're chasing data types that they know are profitable to sell, right? And so really kind of, I think at the heart of the question here is how the activities of this small proportion of really well-resourced folks are influencing and trickling down into broader things as well. And that, I think, is accelerating. That is a problem that is only getting bigger every year.
Hey, can I jump on that really quick, just as a follow-up to Sanders' follow-up? It's a scale thing also, right? You look at, any of the vendors' breach reports that come out each year. It's these massive numbers, like massive numbers of breaches and exploits, right, and the whole bit. And that's because there are a massive number of systems open and exposed to the bad guys. Right. And so getting your arms around it, I mean, I'm not at all suggesting that you don't have to pay any attention to those systems. What I am saying, though, is if all you do is pay attention to the countless number of endpoints that need to be protected, you'll never have the resources to do that. But if you turn the other way, the number of bad guys that are out there, I can't give you the number off the top of my head, but I do know that it's orders of magnitude less than the number of systems that have to be protected. So you get this number of bad guys that's far less, and the number of tools and techniques that they use is pretty small too, right? And so from a scale standpoint, if you can kind of vector your attention to the bad guys and the techniques they use that really don't change as much over time, I think you can apply a greater scale to going after the problem.
Steve, that it occurs to me that one of the real critical issues I think that we want to share with the audience or put out there is, there's been a tremendous investment in security infrastructure that's made by organizations of all kinds, whether you're an enterprise or a government entity or whatever. And yet the attacks, we read about attacks that are successful. Sometimes they're very successful, they're very damaging and things like that. So even though there's that layer of infrastructure already in place, why aren't existing technologies and tools effective enough to protect organizations from cyber attacks, whether they are ransomware or other kinds of cyber attacks? Because of course there's a whole litany of different types of attacks and techniques that are used.
That's a great question, Chandler. It's like you're plugging the article I just wrote for Dark Reading, a couple of weeks ago. it's really remarkable that with our advance in technology, that our approach to cybersecurity hasn't, I don't think anyway, and some might take exception to what I'm saying, but I really just don't think our approach holistically, nationally, to cybersecurity has changed much in 22 years I've been at it. Really, what's, Log4j hit, and everybody's scrambling, right? To patch their systems. How different is that from when Heartbleed hit in 2014, right? 6 years later, it's like the same thing, right? NotPetya hits a few years ago, bad stuff, right? All right, you kind of break down the mechanics in NotPetya, not a whole lot different than the I Love You virus in the summer of 2000. And so it really comes down to, I suppose I'm just going to repeat myself, but I think one of the problems is that, well, I don't know, this might insult some folks on the call, but you've seen these identity protection commercials out there, right? Protect your identity. I'm not going to name anybody, but protect your identity. And you might think, well, that's a really good idea. I should, maybe I should do that. And so they use this word protection kind of very loosely, right? Like when you buy into one of these things, what you get is a service that alerts you when somebody has stolen your identity or is in the process of stealing your identity. Now, if you entrusted me with your valuables and the best I could do is tell you when somebody was stealing them, right? That's not protection, right? But I think the cybersecurity community, it's a very broad statement, so it's not everybody. But I think we've all just gotten used to the idea that protection means, sending an alert and an alarm to me that I can feed into my orchestration or event management tool that I can then, set up some sort of remediation or response for, and then. And so if, unless and until we break that model and get out of the respond to something after it happens model, that's not to say that won't ever happen. Of course, you'll have to respond to incidents as some of them catch you off guard, but we've got to turn this thing around and get more into prevention and use the word protection appropriately.
So, Sander, here's a question that I got from the audience. We've talked a lot about ransomware so far in our webinar, but does the rise in ransomware mean that other kind of more traditional web exploits are less of a problem?
That is a really good question. There are two answers to that. The short answer is that sort of proportionally or comparatively, most organizations are less likely to be compromised by a web exploit right now than they are by something like a ransomware attack chain. And I say that because there are tons of web exploits that can lead to a ransomware attack. So I want to be careful not to sort of confuse the outcome of an attack with the actual tools in the attack. But in general, what we saw over the last couple of years is that there are not that many kinds of organizations that are being hit sort of with the kind of web exploit attack campaigns that were actually sort of the name of the game just 3-4 years ago. Those have become a lot less common, with the one strong exception of retail and e-commerce. And that sector is significantly more likely. I'm trying to remember, I want to say about 3 times more likely to be breached through an attack like a mage card attack or another kind of an injection attack that leads to card skimming. And the reason is that when I was talking about ransomware before as being a really easy way to sell stolen data because you just sell it right back to the victim, credit card numbers are unique in the sense that they are a type of stolen data that's actually really easy to reuse for fraud. And so what we see is those data types that are easy to use for fraud, that's still a really profitable attack chain. And so those folks, retail organizations, but also any kind of organization that is really accepting a lot of payment cards, they're really much more likely to be attacked in terms of the specific, often client side, the payment processing software that is processing those cards. So they are a prime target for web exploits right now. The other thing that I would say about it is we tend to see, especially when we're talking about cybercrime and this kind of economic warfare, we tend to see threat actors default to the most sort of profitable and easiest attack chains. So I can tell you right now, ransomware is a bigger problem, and all those sorts of attacker activities that would lead to a ransomware infection is a bigger problem right now. But the minute that we mitigate that and our malware prevention strategies and our intrusion detection is up to the task, all those web exploits that used to cause a lot of havoc, they're going to come screaming back. So I don't want anyone to think this was an old era and we can relax about this thing, because if we shut off one vector, the other vectors are going to light back up again. The other big exception to this trend that web exploits are sort of a less of a problem are these industry-wide events like Log4j, like SolarWinds, to a lesser degree, actually very much like the Exchange server vulnerabilities, which are widely seen as state-sponsored activity that were starting last, I want to say it was January and February of 21, right? So when we have these sort of industry-wide events, that's a game changer. And then all the sort of normal things that I say about the threat landscape and the probabilities, that all kind of goes out the window, because the attackers know everyone is aware of this thing and the window of opportunity is shutting really fast. So that's why you see when a vulnerability is published like that, whether it's 0-day or close enough to it, that all of a sudden it's like a flash sale, and that will change everybody's behavior overnight. You see the weaponization and the exploit tools sort of distribute across the web in just a couple of days, and the attack traffic sort of spikes. But when we're talking about sort of steady state the rest of the time, not in the context of a big 0-day, the only sector that really needs to be sort of on the lookout for web exploits right now, based on my research, is retail and e-commerce.
So as kind of part of that, from your position, having studied the evolution across a period of time of different kinds of exploits and attacks, can you talk a little bit, since ransomware is such a top of mind topic for so many organizations out there, tell me a little bit about what you've seen from the evolution of ransomware attacks, and what can we learn going forward, applying those lessons from how ransomware attacks have evolved?
Yeah, it's really fascinating, because doing the kind of work that I'm doing, we don't always get really clear answers. And this was actually one where you could see a really distinct change in terms of attacker behaviors in ransomware attacks that really it all came together at the beginning of the pandemic at the top of 2020. There are sort of two really specific behavioral changes, and then one more sort of strategic change. One is that for a long time, attackers used to gain entrance to a network, and then they would just start kind of encrypting things as they found them and sort of just causing havoc. And it was almost sort of like a hacktivist style playbook. And what that meant was that if an organization was really on top of it and they had monitoring in place, they could actually stop a lot of these ransomware infections before they cause a lot of damage. The other thing was because of this tendency, it also made a backup much more likely to succeed, right? And I actually am the first to admit, 10 years ago, when I was working on a SecOps team in a financial services SaaS company, I didn't take ransomware very seriously. I used to think, we had a really robust backup strategy. We tested it pretty often, and we just sort of all thought that this was just sort of not marketing, but like a good advertising for having really good backups. And if you had that, then everything was pretty dialed. And it's not that way anymore, because attackers are gaining entry, and then they are being extremely stealthy, and they have much longer dwell times. And then what they do is they move laterally, they recon the entire environment, they compromise backups, they disable monitoring, they disable security tooling, and they get everything ready. And that's when they trigger the encryption. So these long dwell times, that's one of the evolutions we've seen. The other evolution that we've seen is that attackers are exfiltrating data from the environment before they encrypt anything and using that for leverage in the negotiation. So they say every 24 hours that you don't pay, then we're going to post some of your data up on the dark web. And I was actually just crunching the numbers because we're going to do a little follow-up to the report that I published in February. And we looked at about 1,000 data breaches from the US in 2021. 191 of them were ransomware attacks. Only 3 of them didn't go for an exfiltration technique. So that kind of tells you what the numbers are looking like. So less than 1.5% of ransomware attacks in 2021 didn't use an exfiltration technique. And that says a lot about kind of the dual modality of these kinds of attacks, because I am convinced most attackers, even if they tell you they're going to delete your stolen data, I'm pretty sure most of those folks are taking that to the dark web and selling it to someone else to use for fraud. It also actually, if you're really, really on top of your stuff, it also makes it potentially easier to catch this sort of thing, because if you can catch the exfil, you might be able to, that might be your first clue that there's something going on that you need to respond to. And I say that with a lot of caveats because stealthy exfiltration is something that attackers are very good at. The third trend in terms of ransomware evolution, sorry, Steve, I know I'm going long here.
That's so good.
The third trend is we're just seeing the sort of rise of ransomware as a service. The affiliate model has become more mature over the last couple of years. And we've seen GandCrab was an example that was an affiliate model that was probably the earliest really successful affiliate system. All the signs indicate that sort of movement is becoming more common. That's kind of what I was talking about earlier in terms of division of labor. And I think that is the next evolution that is going to be a big headache in terms of ransomware.
Hey, Sandra, I'm just going to jump on those two, a couple of key points there. I remember those days when ransomware started to unfold and you kind of get all the questions, what's the difference between this and malware? And it's really the outcome that's different. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think a lot of folks just sort of a lot of folks gloss over here is that it all starts with access, whether it's ransomware, malware, stealing state secrets, whatever it is. It starts with access, and then that access has to be sustained, mm-hmm. and managed over some period of time, and then you got to be able to steal what you are intending to steal, or gain it, or pull exfil, what you want, and so independent of the ransomware. Whether it is or not ransomware, it's being able to look for those things and the artifacts of those things as they're occurring. And then again, being able to do something about them as they're occurring. That's so powerful. And it's one of the things, I started with, in my opening statement, it's one of the things that your F5's SSLO is just so uniquely suited for, right? A lot of folks are trying to, as you talked about, there's this whole stealthy aspect of the exfiltration and even the command and control. Oftentimes the access is just right in the front door. I steal some mm-hmm. credentials and I walk in. That's what happened to Colonial Pipeline, yep. Right? But those bad guys had to sustain that access, and then they had to steal all this stuff, along the way. And if you're relying on system logs and net flow to say, oh, it looks like somebody's in my network and stealing stuff, you're not going to see it. These guys they know this stuff, right? You have to be in a position. You must be in a position to examine the content of your network traffic in and out. It's your traffic, right? You've got to be in a position to examine the content of that network traffic. And then added to that, you have to be in a position to do something about that which you see once you see it, right? Ringing the alarm bell that, hey, I'm watching exfil occur, is too late. By the time you've uttered those words, gigabytes of data has gone out the door, right? So that's one of the things that we really have to turn the community around on, is to start embracing this idea that if you really want to do something about this stuff, your only chance is to be able to examine the content for the presence of adversary techniques and tradecraft, and coupled with that, have pre-baked these automated set of capabilities that can do something about that which you find or that which you expose.
Yeah, if I could just Sorry, Steve.
No,
Just to sort of add a little bit of evidence to that, a few years ago, one of my teammates who specializes in web encryption did a study, and he found that just under 3 out of 4 phishing domains and command and control networks that he knew about were communicating with their remote assets over HTTPS, meaning encrypted, right? So that outbound decrypt for actually discovering this kind of malicious traffic is incredibly important. And that was a couple years ago. I can only assume as HTTPS is more common on the legitimate side, more and more attackers are going to be using HTTPS as well. So that sort of visibility and inspection is super important.
It is, and you look at that proof point report that came out a couple of weeks ago, right, where bad guys are bolting on. Either they're bolting malware onto the back of images, or bolting exfiltration on the back of images and uploading those images to places like Dropbox, right? Yep. So if you're looking at your network traffic, at the high level, you say, oh, I've got a whole bunch of users uploading pictures to Dropbox. You're not even you're gonna miss it.
Yep.
You're gonna miss it. You've got to be able to examine that content, and the technology exists. The capabilities exist between what you have and what we have, the ability to expose the network content to tools that can find and defeat tradecraft. Like it's just is a must do, inbound and outbound. It's the only way you're going to get ahead of this stuff.
Yeah, Steve, I want to tag on to that because I got a great question coming in from the audience. Can you discuss an actual example of kind of a nation state level cyber attack? What are the lessons learned that we can glean from that example that would be useful for our audience?
Yeah, I might not be able to do it justice like our lead intelligence guy could, but the thing that happened recently with some of the anti-Russian propaganda stuff in Ukraine, right, where there were these, a whole bunch of dissident sites that had these, anti-Russian documents that you could download if you wanted to spread this propaganda, and they were really popular, right? And of course, there are a bunch of documents, so the way to download them is to pull a zip file down, right, and then open up the zip file. Well, the bad guys knew this, and so I think there was like 48 documents or so inside of these zip files. And they just inserted a malicious LNK file in there, right? Automatically linked to something bad, but by itself, nothing really bad, or not seemingly bad, but just another file inside of a zip file. And people just downloaded these things and open up the zip file, and then you're done, right? You're done. They've dropped their malware, they gained access, and now they own you, right? And so really clear example of especially Russian tradecraft taking advantage of current events, taking advantage of what people are doing, and how they're potentially ignoring things like extra files hidden inside of the zip file, right? And so a cool thing for us was, again, a combination of our two products. I was really proud to know that not only could we, peer inside of the zip file to examine the contents of this thing, but we could see right then and there that there was a malicious LNK. Not that something was added, but we examined the content of each of these things to see if there's anything malicious, and this one surely was malicious. And so anybody downloading one of those zip files, any of our customers downloading those zip files, got all the regular documents, but they didn't get the LNK because we had the ability to peer into that zip file, interrogate every one of the objects inside of it, and remove the object that was malicious, put it all back together again, and deliver it on its way. Super powerful capability. I don't know of anyone else that was able to do that.
Well, thank you so much. The time has really flown by, and as you can imagine, we could go for hours and hours on this very important topic. But we really appreciate your time of our audience and our speakers and everyone that participated. If you'd like some more information about this topic or some of the solutions in terms of what can be done to mitigate and defeat these modern threats, whether they be ransomware or other kinds of cyber attacks, please don't hesitate to visit our website at www.trinitycyber.com or www.f5.com. There's lots of information that's already there. You can obviously click buttons to contact folks, and we'll be happy to have a deeper conversation with you. This has been a very informative and lively session, and we thank you all so much for participating, and we hope to see you soon on the next one. Thank you very much.